A faraway country, a people of whom we know nothing, was how Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain described Czechoslovakia when it was invaded by the Nazis in the 1930s. The same can be said of East Timor, a small country invaded by Indonesia in 1975. Since then, there's been mostly silence. Yet 200,000 people have died. That's a third of the population. The film you're about to see was made in secret. When it was shown on ITV in its original form, the response was extraordinary. Viewers phoned our helpline at the rate of more than 4,000 calls a minute. So much for the myth of public indifference. We are showing this updated version because the people of East Timor are in the news at last, once again fighting for their lives, and because their murderers continue to receive arms from this British government, contrary to its boast about an ethical foreign policy.
Santa Maria Morona Queen, Roma Morona Kami Kinasal, Oras ni Oras ni Lema Tibis Kat
My own family, that is the direct family, with altogether 15 of us. And out of these 15, only 3 of us left.
My oldest brother was poisoned by Indonesian intelligence. I lost 2 oldest brothers, 1 brother-in-law, and 3 sons.
East Timor is a tiny country 400 miles to the north of Australia. A Portuguese colony for more than 400 years, it is surrounded by Indonesia, the 5th largest nation in the world. Led by a military dictatorship, Indonesia has no historical nor legal claim to East Timor. Yet its brutal occupation and genocide have met with mostly silence from the world's leading governments.
Perhaps genocide is too often used these days, but by any standards, that's what's happened here. And it happened mostly beyond the reach of the TV camera and the satellite dish, and with the connivance and complicity of Western governments, the same governments that were prepared to go to war against Saddam Hussein, but were not prepared in almost parallel circumstances to stop a rapacious invader that had broken every provision in the United Nations Charter and had defied no less than 10 United Nations sanctioning resolutions calling on it to withdraw from East Timor. "We should keep our heads down," said a British ambassador to Indonesia, "and let matters take their course." Letting matters take their course, the governments of Britain, the United States, Australia and others supplied the means by which the regime in Jakarta has bled East Timor. This film is the story of that bleeding and of a cover-up that tells us much about the selectivity and aims of great power and how the modern world is ordered.
The people of East Timor themselves have suffered so much that you can see it through their eyes. There is a fear. All the eyes says it all. You don't have to talk to the people of East Timor. Even the little children shows in their eyes, in their face, that they never smile. There's not one single family that has not lost a member of their family. They always have a story to say in terms of women being raped or a young boy would be just snatched from his house and never been able to see it again. And this kind of torture has constantly happened, and it is on a daily basis.
Timor is a land of crosses, crosses etched against the sky, crosses on peaks, crosses on hillsides. This is the grave of just one family, all killed on the same day.
The people in East Timor themselves call it, and we call it, the biggest prison island in the world. That is what it is. It's a hell.
This was Indonesia in the mid-1960s. Books were burned and popular democracy crushed when General Suharto came to power. In the West, Indonesia was seen as an investor's paradise, a huge market, rich in oil and other natural resources. Richard Nixon called Indonesia the greatest prize in Southeast Asia. Suharto and his generals were welcome to the free world. In September 1974, the Australian Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, flew to Indonesia to meet General Suharto. Whitlam regarded good relations with Indonesia as vital to Australia's strategic and economic interests in Asia. Whitlam had supported the rights of small nations all over the world, but he believed East Timor was different.
Mr. Whitlam really made three things fairly clear. One was that when East Timor came to be decolonised, he thought it would be logical and sensible for it to become part of Indonesia, because after all, the Indonesian archipelago already surrounded it. Secondly, he put the view that that should be achieved through an act of self-determination, and had in mind, I think, a period of sort of education, preparation. And thirdly, he made it also plain that if the situation did deteriorate, force should not be used.
Weren't the East Timorese, as far as Western governments are concerned, and especially Australia, simply expendable?
I would agree with you that it was somewhat, the East Timorese were probably seen as expendable by some of the hard-nosed major power brokers, if you like.
More than a year before the invasion took place, we did know that an organisation had been formed which was designed to bring about the integration of East Timor regardless of the wishes of the people. It was actually part of the operations of Operasi Komodo, this subversive operation set up in late 1974.
In October 1974, this man, General Benny Madani, launched a conspiracy with three other generals close to Suharto. It was Operation Komodo. The objective was to destroy East Timor's growing independence movement, which had produced three political groups and promised a flourishing democracy. In January 1975, the main nationalist party, Fretilin, and its more conservative opponents, UDT, formed a coalition which had one aim: independence. But Indonesian agents infiltrated the coalition, undermining it and finally destroying it. The small nation was left to defend itself completely on its own. Western intelligence knew in advance every move the Indonesians made through a top-secret monitoring base near Darwin. On September the 4th, the CIA reported to Washington, 2 Indonesian special forces groups have entered Portuguese Timor, and on September the 17th, Jakarta is now sending guerrillas to provoke incidents that provide an excuse to invade.
We are appealing not only to Australia but to all democratic forces in the world to stop the Indonesian violation of our territory. It is a criminal attempt, a criminal act that should be stopped immediately by all democratic countries in the world.
This is Greg Shackleton, a television journalist from Channel 7 Australia. He and his crew, and another Australian crew from Channel 9, set out to get proof that the Indonesian invasion had secretly begun. There were 5 of them, including 2 Britons. If they could expose Indonesia's clandestine operation, international pressure might stop it. This was Greg Shackleton's last report, the day before he was murdered.
Why, they ask, are the Indonesians invading us? Why, they ask, if the Indonesians believe that Fretilin is communist, do they not send a delegation to Dili to find out? Why, they ask, are the Australians not helping us? When the Japanese invaded, they did help us. Why, they ask, are the Portuguese not helping us? We're still a Portuguese colony. Who, they ask, will pay for the terrible damage to our homes?
The journalists were alone. They were captured alive, shot by the same men who today is Minister of Information of President Habib. The Australians and the British knew all along about it, but they wouldn't admit to the truth because they don't want to sacrifice the arms industry and trade interests with Indonesia.
Did the Australian government ever protest to the Indonesian government for the deaths of
They claim they
Greg and
did.
his companions?
They claim that they asked.
Publicly protest?
No, they asked diplomatic questions, which allowed them to get diplomatic answers.
Well, I certainly delivered protests as ambassador at the time. I guess they're not at the level of the Prime Minister, of course, but...
But isn't that pretty serious when 2 television crews are gunned down by Indonesians, and in this country no one stands up, the leader of the country doesn't stand up and protests in the most vigorous language to those who've done it?
Well, let me say that at that time, this was October 1975, first of all, there was considerable uncertainty in the early days about the facts.
They knew through their intelligence network, within 2 hours of the Balibo incident, where the 5 newsmen were captured and shot, the Prime Minister of Australia knew about it.
Indeed, not only did the Prime Minister know, but it's since been revealed that senior Australian officials conspired in a cover-up and that the Australian government was aware of the murders within hours.
We knew within, I don't know whether it was hours, but within days anyway, that they'd been killed. I'm not, even to this day, precisely sure what happened, except they're very unwise to be where they were.
It's clear that Western governments knew exactly what the Indonesians were planning. Here's a selection of secret diplomatic messages sent from Jakarta by the ambassadors of Britain, Australia, and the United States. The British ambassador, Sir John Archibald Ford, cabled, "It is in Britain's interest that Indonesia absorb their territory as soon and unobtrusively as possible, and when it comes to the crunch, we should keep our heads down." The Australian ambassador, Richard Woolcott, cabled his government, "Although we know it's not true, the formal position of the Indonesian government is that there is no Indonesian military intervention in East Timor." He meant, of course, that the Indonesians were lying, although he strongly advised his government not to question the lie. "We should act," he cabled, "in a way designed to minimize the public impact in Australia and show private understanding to the Indonesians of their problem." The American ambassador noted simply that he hoped the Indonesians would be effective, quick, and not use our equipment. By December 1975, the countdown to the invasion of East Timor was in its final stages. President Gerald Ford and his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger arrived in Indonesia on December the 5th, on a visit described by a State Department official as the Big Wink.
As an example of their certain knowledge of what was about to happen, the embassy's staff were taking unusual measures to plan as many photo and visual opportunities to present Ford and Suharto together, demonstrating unlimited support for Suharto and the Indonesian government. And I thought, wait a minute, something is seriously wrong here. What I saw was that my own government was very much involved in what was going on in East Timor, and that what was going on was not good. You can be 100% certain that Suharto was explicitly given the green light to do what he did.
The Americans persuaded the Indonesians to delay the invasion until after the president had left. And on December the 7th, as the presidential jet climbed out of Indonesian airspace, the bloodbath began.
lot of people are being killed, I repeat, indiscriminately.
These are the hulks of Indonesian landing craft, left as stark reminders to the population on the beach in the center of Dili. When the Indonesians landed here, they began an operation that has been compared in its savagery with Pol Pot's takeover of Cambodia. Hundreds of people were gunned down in the streets, in schools, in shops, in their homes, in the hospital. Live grenades were thrown into houses. Women and girls were raped in front of their families. The Indonesian troops had been told that the East Timorese were communists and primitives who threatened the very existence of Indonesia itself. The strategy was clearly to terrorize an entire nation.
We were learning about it from hard, firm reports from people on the scene in East Timor. Reports of people being herded into school buildings by Indonesian soldiers with the buildings set on fire, and anyone trying to get out being shot, but most of the people being burned alive. People being herded into fields and machine gunned. People being hunted down in the mountains, so anyone out there was in what amounted to a free fire zone.
There was also a systematic pattern to the terror. To many Timorese, their glistening ocean is still known as the Sea of Blood. People were brought here to die in groups, and as in Cambodia, often the first to die were the educated, public officials, teachers, students, nurses. One eyewitness reported the words of an Indonesian officer who, when asked to justify the mass killing of women and children, said, "When you clean the fields, don't you kill all the snakes, both large and small."
We were providing most of the weaponry, helicopters, logistical support, food, uniforms, ammunition, all the expendables that the Indonesians needed to conduct this war.
When Henry Kissinger returned to Washington, he summoned his senior aides. According to the minutes of that meeting, Kissinger expressed his fear that the Congress and public would find out about his complicity with the Suharto regime. Kissinger, on the Timor thing, that will leak in 3 months, and it will come out that Kissinger overruled his pristine bureaucrats and violated the law. How many people know about this? Staff member. 3. Kissinger, plus everybody in this meeting, everything on paper will be used against me. Can't we construe a communist government in the middle of Indonesia as self-defense? He gave orders that shipments of American arms be stopped quietly, but secretly started again the next month. In fact, as the killings increased in East Timor, American arms shipments doubled. In 1981, the Indonesian military force-marched tens of thousands of people at gunpoint in human chains across the island. This was known as the Fence of Legs. The aim was to flush out Fretland guerrillas, with Indonesian troops following on behind and pursuing them into human corrals where they could be captured or killed. Thousands of civilians died in the operation, including children and old people.
As populações começaram a voltar na vila e os javas mataram todos os homens, os velhos e os joventures ali na ribeira de Betuco. São 66 pessoas. Só daí saíram 2 irmãos. Um ainda está vivo. Um ainda está vivo junto de nós no mato e um já rendeu outra vez. Entrou outra vez na vila.
E as mulheres, o que aconteceu com elas?
E as mulheres foram perseguidas pelos javas e violadas e foram massacrados e mataram tantas.
Another form of population control is contraception, given without the permission or knowledge of women, especially the enforced use of the contraceptive drug Depo-Provera. This doctor went to East Timor on our behalf and secretly investigated the use of enforced birth control.
Well, I found in one clinic a very large number of people were being given birth control, I think out of all proportion to the other efforts that were being made, medical efforts that were being made. And I heard many people say that the birth control injection was being given without any explanation to the people who were receiving it as to what it was.
What are they injected with?
Depo-Provera. And again, one clinic claimed to have 500 women being injected, and I found that a very large number, given that very little else seemed to be going on at the clinic.
In 1983, General Suharto received a United Nations prize for his support for family planning. The prize came with a cheque for $12,000. The village of Kararis used to be here until it was razed to the ground by the Indonesians.
That is the village that in 1983, more or less 400 of population, 400 of population were killed by Indonesian troops.
This is an extraordinary list of almost 300 of those murdered in this one village during the summer of 1983. It is evidence of a crime against humanity. The list was compiled by the church in a meticulous handwritten script that records the name, age, date and place of every death of every victim, as well as the Indonesian battalion responsible for each murder. Note the ages and how young they are, and the names of whole families.
Would you agree that what has happened in East Timor has amounted to genocide?
Well, it's, I think, can easily be said in a few words. It was an occupation, military occupation, with brutal force and genocide after that, with hundreds of thousands of people who simply disappeared. The idea, I think, was to totally consolidate this invasion and let it be forgotten, which it was.
I don't know why you ask these questions. Is it simply to promote the bad image of Indonesia, or is it a question that will clarify the situation vis-à-vis the accusations that was made
I asked them because they're accusations made by people across the spectrum from, as I mentioned, the president of Portugal, and he said that what Indonesia had done in Timor was genocide.
Oh, I reject, absolutely I reject that accusations.
While the massacres continued, the agents of great power worked hard to maintain the silence. In January 1976, the American ambassador to the United Nations, Daniel Moynihan, sent a secret cable to Henry Kissinger boasting of the considerable progress he was making in blocking UN action on East Timor. Later, Moynihan wrote, "The Department of State desired that the United Nations prove utterly ineffective. This task was given to me, and I carried it through with no inconsiderable success."
This is the Hotel Flamboyant in the old Portuguese resort town of Bacau, where official visitors were often brought to admire the peacefulness of East Timor under Indonesian rule. What they weren't told, of course, was that the Hotel Flamboyant was used by the military as a torture place. There is extensive official documentation describing how Indonesian soldiers were taught to dress and behave as civilians, pretending to be Timorese whose language they didn't speak, even playing the part of happy, uncomplaining prisoners in comfortable prisons that, of course, didn't exist. There are also documents showing that torture was officially sanctioned with established procedures for the torturer. One such manual is entitled Guiding the Village Comprehensively and lists the do's and don'ts of torture. And here they are. Avoid taking photographs showing torture in progress and when people are being subjected to electric current and when they have been stripped naked, etc. Remember not to have photographs developed outside East Timor, which could then be made available to the public by irresponsible elements. Interrogations should be repeated over and over again until the correct conclusion is drawn.
Jose Amarin, now in exile, was forced as a boy to watch his father being tortured.
I was asked to come in order, all of us, to see my father the time when he was tortured. And then he was tortured by Indonesian. We are looking at the action, and we are warned by the Indonesians that, look, if you kids, for the coming time being, you follow the example of your father, you are against the Indonesians, you will have the same sort life like your father.
These are Hawk ground attack aircraft made by British Aerospace and one of the fastest selling British weapons in the world. In 1978, at the height of the genocide, David Owen, Foreign Secretary in the Labour government, agreed to sell the Hawk to Indonesia. From then on, the British establishment played court to the Suharto regime, while selling it more Hawk aircraft, more missiles, helicopters, frigates, armoured vehicles, mine disposal equipment, military communications, and a fully equipped Institute of Technology for the Indonesian Army. Margaret Thatcher received an award for the promotion of technology. She told her Indonesian audience, "I am proud to be one of you." In 1991, the government of John Major urged its European partners to cut aid to regimes that violated human rights. In the same year, Major shook hands with Indonesia's weapons chief, B.J. Habibie. Later, the government announced a £1 billion deal for more Hawk aircraft, despite the devastation they were causing.
Alan Clark, you were Minister of Defence when the sale of Hawk aircraft were being negotiated and finalised with Indonesia, and your colleagues have talked about getting guarantees from the Indonesians that the Hawks would not be used for oppressive purposes against civilians and, in fact, in East Timor. I mean, what exactly are these guarantees? I mean, that's really what I'm trying to work out.
I never asked for guarantees of that kind. That must have been something that the Foreign Office did before the IDC or whatever it was, whatever committee it is that considers.
So guarantees possible or not? I mean, would you say getting guarantees from a government like the Indonesian government?
A guarantee is worthless from any government, as far as I'm concerned.
I mean, as far as the Hawks were concerned, there was a great deal of talk from all the ministries in British Aerospace that they were merely trainers. I mean, a lot has been made of that. No, they weren't telling the truth.
Well, that's just a label you put on it. I mean, they are trainers. But you said merely trainers. But the Hawk is dual use with a capital D.
Minister, would you dispute this statement, and I quote, "Hawk aircraft have been observed on bombing runs in East Timor in most years since 1984.
I've seen those statements. They have been challenged by the Foreign Office, by British Aerospace previously.
Well, anyway, as you know, Robin Cook made that statement.
Hawk aircraft have been observed in bombing runs in East Timor in most years since 1984.
He was then the front French spokesman on foreign affairs. He made on the 11th of May 1994. Now, it may well be true you haven't granted new licenses, but you've let Hawks go on to Indonesia. Isn't there a huge irresponsibility there somewhere?
No, because we had no power to stop the licenses. The legal advice that we had was that we had no power to revoke the licenses. There was no good cause to do so.
But under your government, the arms trade has boomed. Your colleague, the Defence Secretary, recently congratulated the arms industry for a rise, I think, of 20% in output, profits up, £5.5 billion worth of arms, the second biggest arms salesman in the world. Do you still claim to have an ethical foreign policy?
I would challenge your figures. I would say that we are ethical in terms of the fact that we have very clear criteria for the sale of defence equipment. Those criteria are different from the previous government, and that is that they are criteria that will stop us selling or granting licenses in the context of where there is a risk to regional stability and where there's a risk of internal oppression.
I can distinguish from the nose of the Hawks and Skyhawks, F-15, F-16, and the Broncos. I saw two Hawks on the ground along the airport of Baucau, and I asked people, what about these Hawks? And they said, well, why are you surprised? These Hawks are bombing the mountains of Mativian every day.
Did it ever bother you personally that this British equipment was causing such mayhem and human suffering?
No, not the slightest. Never entered my head. I mean, you tell me that this was happening. I didn't hear about it or know about it.
Well, even if I hadn't told you it was happening, the fact that we supply highly effective equipment to a regime like that then is not a consideration as far as you're concerned. It's not a personal consideration.
No, not at all.
I asked the question because I read that you were a vegetarian and you quite seriously and concerned about the way animals are killed.
Yeah.
Doesn't that concern extend to the way humans, albeit foreigners, are killed?
Curiously not, no.
Shortly after Labour came to power, the Nobel Prize winner Bishop Bello of East Timor came to London, and I heard him make a direct appeal to you and your colleagues. And he said, please, I beg you, do not sustain longer a conflict which without British arms sales to Indonesia could never have been sustained for so long. Aren't you shamed by that statement?
No, indeed, we've done exactly what Bishop Bello asked us to do. We are working totally in line with the proposals put forward by Bello. Our approach is wholly sympathetic to that statement.
Well, I'm not sure it's wholly sympathetic because he was talking about stopping arms sales. And since you came to power, this is the amnesty report, which you'll know very well, of course. You have approved licenses for 64 contracts for arms to the Indonesian dictatorship. They include small arms, machine guns, ammunition, bombs, torpedoes, rockets, missiles, mines, riot control agents, aircraft, and so on and so forth. Do you dispute these facts in the amnesty report?
We'll be publishing the first annual report on arms sales under the new criteria. That will come out in the next few weeks. There is a new set of criteria. We have put those criteria forward. They're open. They were published in July 1997. What you and others and Amnesty will be able to do is to judge the actions we've taken, the licenses we've granted against those criteria. There will be an annual report, totally different departure from the previous government, more open, more transparent, greater accountability.
Right. Well, we'll look forward to that. But in the meantime, could you answer that question? Do you dispute the amnesty figures that your government has approved 64 licenses? Have they got it wrong?
Well, let me say to you that you need to look at that in the report when it comes out.
Excuse me, Minister, it's really a yes or no to
No,
that.
it's not a yes or no, because what you'll see is that Amnesty are making judgments against previous...
No, they're not making judgments.
Categories.
It's a list of facts.
No, it's not a list of facts. Amnesty are making judgments against previous categories. Those categories may well change in the annual report. There may well be greater detail.
So this amnesty list is incorrect. It's wrong.
I think the Amnesty people who compiled that list would recognise that there is greater detail that we can make available. We hope to make that greater detail available in the annual report. When that greater detail is made available, then the categories make even greater sense than they do at the moment.
But in the meantime, people are being killed in East Timor. We're talking about what will happen, and I don't understand why you can't explain what has already gone on.
Well, we will explain. That will be in the annual report.
Why not say it now?
Because the annual report will bring it together. An annual report comes out, if I can just make this point, on a yearly basis. You don't need to have that on a weekly basis, otherwise it would subvert the purpose. It is an annual report which will bring together all the licenses that we've granted for each and every country.
Right. Jose Ramos Horta, when I interviewed him the other day, described your government as hypocrites.
Well, I think he's wrong in what he's saying there, and fundamentally wrong, because we have been active. We have provided a lot of support for the diplomatic process. We've used whatever good offices we have to persuade the process to move forward. We will continue to take that active diplomatic role. I don't see any hypocrisy or inconsistency there. We've always had one very clear objective, and we will continue to work towards that clear objective.
The United Kingdom is still the biggest arms supplier to Indonesia. Why not freeze, as Jose Ramos Horta asked you to do, why not merely freeze arms sales?
Well, there are different statements from individuals, but what individuals recognise is that the new arms criteria are tougher and more effective. You'll have to wait for the annual reports, as I've already indicated, to make your judgment on that, but we have a new criteria.
You mentioned annual reports. Well, this is an annual report, your human rights report, published by the Foreign Office for 1998. The section on Indonesia is striking for its omission. There's no mention here of the fact that you are a major arms supplier to that country. Isn't that a distortion?
Let me say to you that we can point with pride to what we've done on the human rights side in Indonesia. We've worked with the Human Rights Commission. We're helping to establish free press, to help the democratic process. All of those moves are going in the right direction in Indonesia, and the United Kingdom's record on human rights and pro-democracy activity is a very, very strong and impressive one.
I have had enough. I have had enough of the hypocrisy in these past 23 years. Really, frankly, no one can convince me that these people running foreign policy in most of the Western countries tell the truth, that they mean what they say when they talk about democracy and human rights.
One of the biggest prizes for the West is the Timor Gap oil treaty between Indonesia and Australia, which allows foreign companies to exploit the huge oil and gas reserves in the seabed off East Timor. This is Australian Foreign Affairs Minister Gareth Evans and Indonesian Foreign Minister Ali Alatas. They're flying over the oil fields of Timor, toasting each other as they celebrate the treaty and the division of spoils.
I think if you think back over the whole period, the other agreements, the relationship we've had has been very significant, very important. But this is really unique and uniquely important. And for that reason, it's really quite an historic occasion that we're now witnessing today.
They could at least be more discreet about it. It was so obvious that they were ripping off the wealth of East Timor. First, Indonesia invaded East Timor, and Australia recognized that invasion, that annexation, saying that it is for the good of the people of East Timor. Australia kept telling us and Indonesia that East Timor is too poor anyway to be viable as an independent state. But then they go on, sign a treaty to exploit the immense oil reserves of the Timor Sea area. It is again a display of audacity, of hypocrisy.
It's the blood that they're signing, it's people's blood. The Timorese haven't had a say in it, and it belongs to us. It belongs to the people of East Timor, not to Australia or Indonesia.
On October the 28th, 1991, an unarmed Timorese student, Sebastio Gomez, was shot dead at this church by Indonesian agents. Here he is mourned by his friends and his mother. Two weeks later, on November the 12th, the people of Dili, the capital, held an extraordinarily brave demonstration as a tribute to the dead boy. It was also a cry for freedom that the Indonesians did not want the outside world to hear. What was unusual was that the terrible events that followed were witnessed by foreigners and were filmed.
Mr. Ambassador, I was looking at a statement by Amnesty International which described the situation there as one of arbitrary arrest, torture, disappearance, executions and massacre. Are they lying?
Yes, I think
Amnesty is lying, really.
They are not. They have no corroborated evidence. Maybe they have letters written by those who are anti-integration. I must admit that there are few of the East Timors who still don't want to have the integration.
But General Sutrisno said that anyone who doesn't toe the line in Indonesia will be shot, and we will shoot them.
But despite of that statement, have you seen people being shot? Because
no, but we've seen clearly on television people being shot. It was filmed in the Santa
yes,
Cruz
of course, that
cemetery.
was the incident of 12 November.
After the cemetery massacre, the British government increased aid to Indonesia to £81 million, a rise of 250%. At the same time, 11 more contracts under the Timor Gap Treaty were awarded to Australian companies. Gareth Evans described the massacre as an aberration.
We have interviewed a number of people who have given evidence that the survivors of those killings in 1991, many of them were themselves killed.
That is completely untrue. That is completely untrue.
Why should these people lie to us? You know, we have names and places, and these are people who actually speak to us in fear of their personal safety. Why should they lie to us?
Again, as a political observer, I think you should understand that in politics, you can pursue your objective by throwing dirt. You know, this is politics. You know, we should not be too naive.
Shortly after that interview, we revealed that there was a second unreported massacre, bringing the total number of people murdered and missing to more than 400.
After they stopped shooting, those who had survived, the ones who could have been saved because they were only wounded in the legs and arms, they were stabbed with bayonets. The ones still inside the cemetery who were still breathing, but lying on the ground, their heads were crushed with rocks until they died.
So you actually saw the Indonesian soldiers bayoneting the survivors, did you?
Yeah.
Almost everything began to change in November 1994 when a group of young East Timorese occupied foreign embassies in Jakarta while Suharto was greeting world leaders. This audacious action by the East Timorese helped galvanize a popular uprising in Indonesia itself. And when in 1996 Jose Ramos Horta and Bishop Carlos Bello of East Timor were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, events moved quickly, with the dictatorship struggling to contain the revolt in both countries. In Indonesia, students now openly defied the regime, and in 1998, Suharto was forced to step down. But the regime itself had hardly changed, with the dictator's protege, B.J. Habibie, the new president, and the military still holding power. In order to gain international respectability as the economy collapsed, Habibie offered the East Timorese autonomy within Indonesia. The imprisoned East Timorese leader, Shanana Gusmao, rejected this outright. In August 1998, Indonesia invited the world's media to observe its troop withdrawal from East Timor, but this was a fake. Other troops had landed at night with British-supplied weapons, and today East Timor is more heavily occupied than at any time for 5 years. Would you say to the Indonesians now, get your troops out of East Timor?
I would definitely say that.
Would you, as President of Portugal, give a pledge that Portugal would stand by the East Timorese until independence? Okay, let me add to that. Until independence, if that was the wish of the East Timorese people through a referendum.
If the negotiations in the United Nations get to a point where a referendum is taking place, and that will be the solution coming out of the referendum, we have to defend that solution because it has been internationally accepted.
However, in talks sponsored by the United Nations, a UN envoy privately discussed a status for East Timor similar to that of Hong Kong. So hope is tempered by the hint of betrayal by the great powers. The British government, for one, refuses to make a commitment to East Timor's independence.
We survived 23 years of international betrayal. We survived 5 American presidents. We survived Margaret Thatcher. It's not easy to survive Margaret Thatcher, and we did survive her as well. Maybe 20 years ago, independence was in our dreams, imagination. No, now victory is around the corner, and nothing is going to stop us.
Many years have passed by, many more to come. Surrender? No, never, 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 never. 200,000 Timorese have died. Yet, Ramelau is strong as ever. I'm still fighting. I'm still fighting. In my mountains, in my jungle, in my villages, in the
200,000 people, almost all of them non-combatants, died simply because a man, former Secretary of State Kissinger, his ego got in the way. And General Suharto's ego got in the way. Why not simply leave the East Timorese alone to do whatever they wanted to do? Why not let them alone?
We still believe that we can win and that we can count on all those people around the world who care to listen, that nothing is impossible if we persist on, that peace and freedom is worth fighting for.
I'm still fighting for my country.
The evidence is there. You cannot turn a blind eye anymore. If you do, that means you're not human.
I want to be free, that's all I want. I want to be.
Are international relations at the close of the 20th century to be dominated by euphemisms and lies that override justice and make small nations expendable? The fate of the people of East Timor is pivotal to this. For if we allow our governments to arm their oppressors and steal their resources, and to do so in our name, how can we then claim the universal rights that are denied them.
If you would like to know more about East Timor, please call 0845 304 3333. Lines will be open until 12:30 tonight. Calls will be charged at local rates. That's 0845 304 3333.